April of 1884. The stage from Laramie set Margaret Shaw down at the Crossroads store with one carpetbag, a folded newspaper, and a name she did not yet trust. The advertisement was 3 lines long, cut from the Cheyenne Daily Leader, and worn soft at the creases from too much reading on the road. Widower, it said, near Dry Hollow on the Sweetwater, seeks a respectable woman to keep house and mind 2 motherless girls. Wages, $8 the month, and a room of her own. She had answered it because the wage was the wage, and because a woman of 26 with no husband and no living kin had to answer something. What the 3 lines did not say, as what no such notice ever says, was that the house she was riding toward held a secret folded into its walls, and that she would be the one to find it. The man who came for her drove a flatbed wagon and one tired roan, and he did not smile. He was somewhere in his 30s. The sun and a stretch of hard seasons made it impossible to say closer than that. Tall and broad through the shoulders, dark hair gone shaggy under a tan wide-brim hat, a short dark beard, and gray-blue eyes that had the look of a man who had not slept properly in a long while. "Tom Bell," he said, and that was nearly all he said for the first hour of the road. Margaret sat with her bag on her knees and watched the sage roll past in long silver waves and decided he was a hard man. She decided fast and on too little, the traveler's vice, and she would spend the rest of that season learning what that first hour had cost her. The cabin sat in a fold of land where Dry Hollow Creek bent west, a square of squared logs with a stone chimney and a sod roof gone green with April. 2 children stood in the doorway when the wagon creaked up. The elder was 7, all elbows and watchfulness, a girl named Ruth, who held her little sister's hand like a soldier holding a line. The younger was 4, Sarah, with her thumb in her mouth and her face pressed into her sister's skirts. Neither child ran to their father. Tom Bell climbed down from the wagon seat, and neither girl moved toward him, and the stillness of it, the 3 of them in the yard without moving, told Margaret more than the silent hour on the road had managed to say. The cabin was clean in a man's way, corners ignored, a film of wood smoke on everything, beans burned to the bottom of the one good pot. There was a churn nobody had turned in days, and milk going on the turn beside it. Tom Bell set her bag inside the door and stood with his hat in his hands, as though he had forgotten what a person does next. "Their mother passed in the winter," he said finally. "Childbed fever, the baby with her." He looked at the floor. "Ruth quit talking near about then. Don't know why. Doctor says nothing's wrong with her throat." He set his hat back on. "I'll be at the far fence till dark." So that was the wage and the work and the wound, all of it inside 10 minutes. Margaret rolled her sleeves. She found flour weevily but usable, found the milk could still be skimmed if she hurried, found a girl of 7 who would not speak, and a girl of 4 who would not let go of her. She did not try to make them love her that first day. She made bread. She set the dough to rise on the warm stone of the hearth, and she let Sarah press her small thumbprints into the second loaf. And at supper she did not remark when Ruth ate 3 slices and said nothing. Some things you mend by not looking at them straight. That first night she lay awake in the lean-to room off the kitchen. Her own room, as the notice had promised, a rope bed and a washstand and a window the size of a Bible, and listened to the house. She heard the man pacing the main room long after the girls were down. 3 steps and a turn, 3 steps and a turn. The floor of a man worn into a path he could not get off. She heard a child in the loft breathing the careful, listening breath of someone who does not sleep. She had taken many positions in her life, and most houses tell you their trouble slowly. This one had told her everything by midnight. She lay there and thought about the wage she would earn for all of this, and very nearly cried, and did not, because crying was a thing she had given up the same season the girl in the loft had given up talking. In the morning, she set a plate at the head of the table and would not let him eat, standing at the door. "Sit," she said, the first order she had given him. And he looked at her, startled, and then, slowly, he sat. Sarah climbed onto his knee uninvited, which seemed to surprise him more than the order had. Ruth said nothing, but she set the spoons round without being asked, 3 of them, and then, after a pause, a 4th. For Margaret, it was the smallest thing. Margaret noticed it the way you notice the first thaw crack in river ice, there, and then the whole surface moving at once. That first week she counted what the house lacked. 11 cracked panes she puttied with a paste of ash and grease. 9 fence rails down along the creek pasture that Tom Bell had not got to. 7 hens that should have been laying and were not, because the coop sat in shadow, and a fox had been at the wire. She moved the coop into the morning sun, mended the wire with a length of baling twine, and inside 3 days the hens gave 4 eggs, then 5, then a steady 7 again. The same 7 hens only returned to their proper work. Sarah carried the eggs in her apron like treasure, and dropped exactly 1 a day, and Margaret learned not to mind. Tom Bell watched all of it from the edges. He was not a cruel man. She saw that by the 2nd week, and was ashamed she had needed 2 weeks to see it. He was a man whose grief had walked off with his habit of speech, and so he kept his hands moving, fence, stock, the spring branding, the long ride to the high pasture, because motion asked nothing of a man's heart. He had 240 acres on the Sweetwater bench, and 40 head of cattle wearing the Bell brand, and a note at the Rollins Bank he never spoke of, and she was not meant to know about. She knew about it anyway. A house tells on a man if you live in it. The girl Ruth was the puzzle that mattered. Margaret did not push her. She talked at her low and constant, and about nothing consequential, patient as a woman gentling a skittish mare. She taught her to knead, to skim, to trim the lamp wick so it would not smoke. Ruth did everything asked, and not one thing more, and at night Margaret heard her in the loft, awake, breathing careful, and once heard her crying in the particular silent way of a child who has learned that crying out loud brings nothing back. It was the locket that opened it. Cleaning the loft in May, Margaret pulled the children's tick to air it, and her hand found something hard sewn into the seam, a thin gold locket, no bigger than a thumbnail, the kind a woman is buried in or a woman hides. She worked it free of the threads. Inside was a coil of pale hair, and scratched on the back in a small careful hand 2 words, "For Ruth." The mother had hidden it there before the fever took her. She had sewn her own keeping into her daughter's bed so the child would have her near, and then the words had died with her, and no one living knew it was there. Margaret sat on the loft floor with the locket warm in her palm, and understood the shape of the silence in the house at last. She climbed down the ladder and found Ruth at the churn, and knelt so their eyes were level, and opened her hand. "I found this in your bed," she said. "I think your mama put it there for you. See? Your name." Ruth looked at the locket. She looked at the pale hair coiled inside it. She put out one finger and touched it, and her face came apart all at once, a single afternoon's thaw after months of frozen. And the first word the child had said since January was the smallest and the oldest word there is. "Mama," she said. Then she was crying out loud at last, not the silent kind, but the real kind, into Margaret's shoulder, and Margaret held her and did not say a single useless thing about it. Tom Bell came in at dusk to the sound he had not heard in 5 months, his daughter's voice hoarse and wet, and saying her sister's name, the two girls tangled together by the fire. He stood in the doorway with the cold at his back. Margaret showed him the locket in the lamplight and told him where it had been and what was scratched on it. He turned it over and over in his rough hands. He was gone a long while to the barn, and when he came back, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he said only, "She made that the autumn before. I wondered where it went." He set it round Ruth's neck himself, his hands not steady, and the girl reached up and touched his bearded jaw, and something that had been frozen in that cabin since January began, very slowly, to loosen. After that the house changed by degrees, too small to mark and too large to miss. Ruth talked, not a flood, but a creek, finding its bed again, one word, then a sentence, then a question. Sarah laughed, a sound like a hen surprised. Tom Bell took to coming in for the noon meal instead of eating cold biscuit at the fence, and he began haltingly to talk about the grass, the price of beef in Rawlins, the brother in Ohio he hadn't written in 2 years. Margaret found she looked forward to noon. She did not let herself look at why. There was an evening in late May she kept afterward like a pressed flower. A cow had gone down calving in the creek pasture, and Tom Bell had been out in the rain past dark, with his arm into the shoulder, and he came in soaked and gray, and cradling his left hand where the cow had crushed it against a fence rail. Margaret had him sit at the table and lit the second lamp, and took the hand in both of hers in the good light. 2 fingers were swelling fast, and the small bones along the back were wrong under the skin. She had nursed her father through 3 years of dying, and she knew a break from a bruise. "These 2 are cracked," she said. "Not the joints. They'll knit if you let them." She splinted them to a length of churn dasher with strips off an old shirt, firm but not cruel, and she did it without once telling him to be brave about it. He watched her face the whole while, not the hand. When she finished, he flexed the wrapped fingers and said, low, "My wife used to do that. The splinting, I'd forgot anybody knew how." It was the first time he had named the dead woman as a person and not a wound, and Margaret understood it for the gift it was, and only nodded and banked the fire. Then came the June afternoon the bank rider came out from Rawlins. Margaret was at the line with the washing when he rode up, a soft-handed man in a good coat with a paper in his saddlebag, and she watched Tom Bell's whole body change as he read it. She watched his shoulders drop and his jaw go tight and his eyes go somewhere past the fence line. The note was called. $200 against the place, taken in a bad year to buy seed and a second team. And the new man at the Stockmen's Bank wanted it in full by the 1st of August, or he would take the deed. The land baron's hand was in it. Coyle, the big silver-haired cattle king whose fences crept a little west every spring and who had wanted the Sweetwater bench for its water for 3 years running. A foreclosed place sold cheap. Tom Bell folded the paper and went to the far fence till dark, because he had always handled things that way, by moving until the feeling passed, or wore itself out, or asked less of him than it had at the start. 61 days to the 1st of August. Margaret counted them alongside everything else she counted. She also counted what was true that the bank writer had not. This man had 240 good acres, 40 head, 7 laying hens, 2 daughters who had started smiling again, and a housekeeper who had not been paid in 2 months because she had quietly told him to keep her wages against the seed bill, and who had, in a trunk under her rope bed, the secret of her own. She had told no one, on the Sweetwater. She had come west with $68 sewn into her hem, her whole inheritance, the sum of a school-teacher father dead of consumption in Ohio, and a small house sold to pay his doctor. She had guarded it across 2 territories. It was meant to be her wall against the world, the one thing that meant she would never again be entirely at any man's mercy. With 49 days left to August, she sat on the floor of her room with the coins in her lap and did the arithmetic a person does only once or twice in a life. The sum was not 200, but the sum and 40 head of cattle and a man's remaining pride pressed together and stretched right could be close enough. She did not hand Tom Bell the money. A proud man handed money by his housekeeper is a man broken twice. Instead, she sat at the table where he could see her working the figures, and she showed him what the summer could yield if he moved fast. She showed him that 11 of his 40 head were steers fit for the Rawlins market right now, 3-year-olds, good deep-sided animals, and that the early gather Coyle's outfit would not expect could put $165 cash in his hand if he drove them himself this week at 15 a head. She showed him that the wool off the dozen range sheep he kept for the house, that he'd never thought to sell, would bring $9 at the Rawlins Mercantile. She showed him the egg money she had been setting by in a tin, coin by coin, the same tin Sarah dropped 1 egg from every morning. $8 of it now, saved in 2 months of market days. And then last, she set her own folded handkerchief on the table and opened it, and the gold caught the lamp. 68, she said. Mine, free and clear, lent, not given. I'll want it back when the place is square, and interest in fence rails. Tom Bell looked at the money and looked at her for a long moment that had nothing of the fence in it. Why? He said. Because you were wrong about me, Margaret said, and I was wrong about you, and I am tired of us both being wrong. Drive the steers Thursday. He drove them Thursday. He drove them himself, the early gather, 22 miles to the Rawlins yards, before Coyle's riders knew the bench was being worked. He sold 11 head at $15 apiece, and came home with $165 in a flour sack, and his back straighter than she had seen it. The wool went the same week at $9. The egg tin went on to the table. Together with her savings, it was more than $200, and there was margin left for the feed bill besides. It was at the Rawlins yards, the morning of the sale, that he met Coyle face to face. The cattle king came down the rail in his black frock coat, silver hair under a flat-crowned hat, and leaned on the top board to watch the Bell steers wade. Early to be selling, Coyle said, pleasant as a snake in the shade. A man only gathers in July when a man is pressed. I'd have given you a fair price for the whole bench, Bell, water and all. Save you the trouble of August. Tom Bell did not look up from the scale. Bench isn't for sale, he said. Coyle smiled the smile of a man accustomed to buying things that weren't for sale, "Everything's for sale by the 1st," he said, "when the bank holds the paper." And Tom Bell, who 6 weeks before would have gone silent and ridden off to stare at the horizon till the feeling passed, looked the cattle king dead in his pale eyes and said, "Then you'll want to ride out on the second coil and see whose name is still on the deed." He said it quiet. It was the quiet that made Coil stop smiling. The cattle king straightened off the rail and walked away, and that was the whole of the war, fought over a weighing scale and a handful of plain words, won by a man who had finally been given a reason to fight. On the 31st of July, with 1 day to spare and the count run at last to its final number, Tom Bell rode into Rawlins and laid $200 on the new banker's desk and watched the deed come back across it with his own name still on it. Coil's man was in the street when he came out and said something low, and Tom Bell only touched his hat and rode home to a cabin where the lamp was already lit for him. He came in and set the deed on the table next to the empty egg tin. Ruth was reading aloud to Sarah by the fire, slow and careful, finding her voice again in the school book Margaret had carried west in her bag. The bread was rising on the warm stone of the hearth. Tom Bell stood with his hat in his hands, just as he had on the very first day. But the silence was different now, a silence with room in it. And when he found the words, they came out plain. "I advertised for a woman to keep my house and mind my girls," he said. "I got back more than my cabin mended. Ruth talks. Sarah laughs. The place is mine because of you and your savings that I will be paying back the rest of my life if you'll let me. I'm not a smooth man, and I won't pretend otherwise. But there's a circuit preacher comes through Dry Hollow the second Sunday of every month, and I'd be honored, Margaret, if you'd let me ask him to read for us, not as housekeeper, as my wife." Margaret Shaw had crossed 2 territories with her whole worth sewn into her hem, so she would never again be at any man's mercy. She had answered a 3-line notice because a woman of 26 with nothing and nobody had to answer something. What she found was not what the notice described, but then the best things rarely are, and some gifts come dressed as the ordinary and arrive without warning. She felt, standing in that lamplight, not surrender, but the opposite, the particular piece of a person who has been weighed at her true value at last. $8 the month was a poor wage, she said, for all this trouble. And then she smiled, and that was the yes. They were married the second Sunday of August, 1884, in the cabin on the Sweetwater bench, with Ruth holding the locket at her throat and Sarah dropping the ring once before the preacher got it back. The loan was never asked for again and never needed to be, having long since turned into something a ledger cannot hold. Margaret Bell lived on that bench another 40 years. The land stayed in the family through the dry years and the hard winter of '86, and 2 more children after Ruth and Sarah. The thin gold locket passed down to Ruth, then to Ruth's eldest, then on, and somewhere it still keeps a coil of pale hair and 2 words scratched in a dying woman's hand, words that a woman who came west on a promise happened to find sewn into a child's bed, and so gave back a daughter, her mother, and a man, his family, and herself, a home she had not known she was looking for. The notice promised a wage and a room of her own. History does not record what the woman gave in return, because the things she mended were not the kind that go in any ledger. A child's stopped voice, a man's set-down grief, a deed nearly lost, a heart that had decided on too little evidence and too young that it was safer to expect the worst of people. She had been wrong about Tom Bell in the first hour of the road. Most of us are wrong about someone in the first minute, and most of us never get the season it takes to find out how wrong. If this story stayed with you, sit with it a moment. Have you ever been certain about someone in the very first minute, hard and fast and on too little, and then been given the time to learn how wrong you were? Tell me in the comments who it was. And if you would like another story about a person the world wrote off who turned out to be worth far more than anyone bargained for, it is right here, and it is waiting.